Hello friends, myself Pramod Kumar Saini. I am assistant professor at JVBI University, Jain Vishwabharati University at Ladnu, Nagaur, Rajasthan. Today we are going to start the BA part first, semester first in English literature, topic 4 one-act plays in English. The 4 one-act plays which takes a very important part in your course. The first is from the Anton Chekhov, which is a Russian writer, the Boor. And the second from Stanley Houghton, the Dear Departure. And the third is Norman MacDonald's The Bishop's Candlesticks. And the last, John Galsworthy's The Little Man. These are the 4 one-act plays which shows you about the comedy, the comic relief, or the sentimental mentality of the rich persons or sympathy with the poor persons, as the Anton Chekhov shows in his plays. Now, we are going to start the first act, the Boor. You can see the picture of Mr. Anton Chekhov, who was born in 1860 and that was 1904, and died in 1904. Anton Chekhov was a Russian author. He was a very famous storyteller. He wrote many stories for the children and many moral stories for the elder person also. And you can see the Beer, which was translated in English as the Boor, a joke in one act. It's a little joke about the high society, or we can say high profile society, the sentimental of the rich society people, many other elements in this story. This is a story about a woman who has lost her husband recently. But she mourning and mourning and mourning continuously for many months for her husband, who was not a proper person, who was not a good guy. He beats her or he behaved very rudely with her, but she refused to stop mourning. She has a servant. The name of the servant is Luca. He's a very interesting guy. He wants to help her mistress. He tried to console her. He tried to pursue her that she should forget her husband and show and see there are many persons who can be the life partner of her. But she refused, and she gave bad. She rebuked her servant for this type of talking, because she is a widow now. She said that a widow has to live her whole life in the memory of her husband. She was a typical old woman who believes that a woman has no right to live a life after the death of her husband, or to live an entertainmentful life or a joyful life after that of someone's husband. She has a thought that although her husband was very bad, but she was not bad. She loves her husband very much. And this attachment shows the intimacy or the love of Mrs. Popov, which was Mrs. Helena Popov, and her love to her husband. Luca tries again and again, but fails. At last, the situation became very dramatic. There came another character, Mr. Smirov, who was an oat merchant or a businessman, who came there to take her money back, who was given to her husband. And another time, she wants his money back. He wants his money back, and she refuses, and she excuses to him that she have no money today, and she will give the money the next day, because her manager has gone to the city. But he determined. He refused to go. He said that he will not move a bit from there while his money was not given to him. She feel that, and there was a dramatic situation. She take a pistol and want to kill her, and then suddenly a dramatic situation goes to in a turn in a love scene. Luca also was surprised. So now look line to line. What are the characters of this play, or who was Anton Chekhov? Now start with the introduction of Chekhov. Anton Chekhov. He was a Russian author. Mostly his plays are written in Russia and then translated into English, into China, into Hindi, and in Arabic, in many languages all around the world. He was one of the most famous writers, poets, and author all around the world. His stories are very well read all around the world. He is a short story writer. Most of his stories has a comic element, especially this story, The Boor, has a very interesting comic element in the last scene. Realistic, the situation in his stories are very realistic, and they have the wide appeal all around the world. These are the specialty of Russian author Anton Chekhov. He always want to ridicule the rich. He always shows the artificiality or the hypocrisy of the rich people in his stories. Sympathize with the poor. His stories show the sympathy with the poor person, as in the proposal, as in the Boor. We see the hypocrisy of the rich people, which is very interesting. Next, the Boor or the Bear. It is a one-act play. In Shakespeare's times, the plays were written in five acts. The first act is the introduction of the characters. Second is the rising action. Third is the climax, the top of the story, and the fourth is the declining action, or can be falling action, and last is the denouement, means the conclusion. This is the structure of the Shakespearean times play, five-act plays. Then the time goes on third act plays. First act is introduction and rising action. Second is climax, and third is falling and denouement, or the conclusion. Then the time changed, and we saw the two-act plays. First act introduction, and second is climax and falling action with the end. In these days, in last 100 years, we saw many writers write one-act plays because we have no time to see the five-act long plays. We have a shorter time in our life because we became very busy. The time became the money. So the one-act plays are very popular in these days. Anton Chekhov also tried to write many of them in one act. This act is dedicated to Nikolai, which was one of his fellows in the theater, who was a friend of Chekhov also. He is a friend of Chekhov in the time of his theater time. Now, the characters of this play. First is Helena Ivanovna Popov. Popov was the surname which was given by her husband. Mr. Popov was dead by some reasons. Now, Mrs. Helena Popov is mourning for her husband's death. Although he was dead many months ago, but she refuses to stop the weeping, to stop the crying for her husband, to stop the mourning for her husband. She continuously mourning and mourning many months. The third important character is Luca. Luca was the servant of Mr. and Mrs. Popov. Luca want to console, want to reduce the grief, the sadness of Mrs. Popov, but fail. Because Mrs. Popov does not want to stop her crying. She wants to remember her husband all the lifetime. She said that her husband was buried in a graveyard, and she also buried herself in the four walls of her house. She refused to meet anyone. She refused to talk to anyone, and she went only weeping, crying, and mourning for her husband. Luca tried once again but failed. He gave him a proposal that if she goes out of the house, she met many persons and she became happy, and she can get another colleague or another fellow for her rest life, another lovable fellow for the rest life of her. But she refused. She covered herself in the house. She caged herself in the house. Now the story turned a new dramatic turn. Garigri Stepnovich Smirov entered or marched into the house without any announcement. He came abruptly. Mrs. Popo said that she was not at home and said to Luca that inform whoever was on the door that the mistress is not at the home. But Smirov was a very rude fellow. He entered into the house without any permission, and she said that I want my money back. Mrs. Popo, surprised at the behavior of Smirov, and asked, what type of money do you want to me? Smirov also became surprised because he had given the money to her husband. He explained his situation, that I am an oath merchant and I gave money and oath to many persons. Many persons borrow from me and use the money, and your husband one of them. I want the money back today because I am in a trouble, I am in a critical situation. I want the money back so I can be saved. She asked the money from Mrs. Popo. Mrs. Popo excuses him that she has no money that day because her husband was dead and the manager of her property has gone to the city for some work. But Smirov thinks that it is excuses from the lady, so she called all the ladies fickle. Now, see the play's important points. The Boor is a comedy. Comedy means we find a relief at the end of the play. A series of contrasts. In this play, we saw that there are many contrasts. Mrs. Popo, who refused to stop the mourning, at last accept the love of Mr. Smirov. Mr. Smirov, who wants only money, also fall in love with Mrs. Popo and proposes her to marry. This shows the contrast between the characters. Mrs. Popo mourns and mourns continuously. Luca tried to pursue Mrs. Popo. He wants that her mistress don't mourn for the wrong fellow, because Mr. Popo was not a good fellow. He was very rude. His rude behavior with his mistress make this. Mrs. Popo to refuse to give up mourning to Luca. Luca tries and tries and tries. She shows devotion to her husband. Mrs. Helena Popo shows her devotion to the husband. She shows that her husband was not a good person, but she is. Why does she stop the mourning of her husband while she was a good, dedicated wife? She wants to mourn all life for her husband. Smirov enters in their house without any permission. A trader demands the money which her husband had borrowed from him. Smirov is a trader of oats, which is used for the horses, which is a meal for the horses. Smirov gave the money or the oat to Mr. Popo. Now he wants the money back because he was in a critical situation. And this is the climax of this story goes to a climax when he wants his money back, and Mrs. Popov refuses to give the money because she have no money at that time, and suddenly they ask each other for a duel. Their talking became very violently, and they want to struggle, they want to fight with each other, and they ask for duel to each other. Now we can say that the rich families or the rich attitudes shows the little things goes on a higher things, as we can say the little statement or little dialogue goes to a duel, goes to a battlefield. Then she excuses at that time. Spiro refuses to leave without the money. She said that I will not move a bit without the money, because all the debtor of mine said to me that there is no money at the time with me. Why? I have given the money to them. Why don't they have the money? So he wants only the money. He became angry because no debtor gives him money. He calls fickle to all women. Mrs. Popov refuses, argues with him. Mrs. Popov argues that if a woman make a mistake, all the women are fickle, it is not the correct judgment. But Mr. Smirov refuses to take his word back. She said that it is the man who is fickle. Now, the dialogue became more violent. Their argument goes so far as to call for a duel, and another accept it. Mrs. Popo brings her husband's pistol. It is a very brave step she takes. She became very angry, and she goes into the house and takes the pistol of her husband to kill Mr. Smirov, who was very rude, who don't know how to behave with a woman, etc., etc. But she does not know how to use it. She don't know. She doesn't know. She takes the pistol and want to shoot Mr. Smirov, but don't know from where she can shoot a bullet. She was in a critical situation. Mr. Smirov, who stands something far from the Mrs. Smirov, want to tell her or want to teach her how to use the pistol. At the start, she don't allow him, but at last she accept him and said that please tell me how to use it. Now this is a dramatic situation. She wants to kill her, and she wants to kill him, and he is going to help the woman. What a fish. Smirov instruct her. She take an interest in her and to show her how to shoot the bullet, how to use the pistol, and when he touches her, he falls in love with her. He proposes her abruptly, and she accepts. This is a very dramatic situation. Mr. Smirov proposes Mrs. Popov, and she accepts because she was a hypocritic woman. She continuously mourned for her husband because she is very devotee. She is very devotional in her love. But when he finds another fellow, she forget about everything and she accepts the proposal of the another person. This shows the false sentiments of the rich society. Luca found them in an embrace. When Luca entered into the house, he saw that they are embraced each other into the house. There is another minor character is the horse of Mr. Popo, which needs oats, for which he borrowed money from the Smiro, from the merchant Smiro. At first, she cares the horses of her husband very carefully. But when she founds a fellow, she refused to give oat to the Toby, because there is no need to give the oat to Toby, because there is no need of her last husband, the dead husband, because she get a new. This shows the false sentiments of rich society. This shows the false relationship of rich society. This shows the unmovable, movable and shakeable relations of the foreign society. When she accepts her proposal, she, take, she gave an embrace to Mr. Smiro. Suddenly, Luca entered into the house. And what does Mrs. Popo said? Look at that. The Toby isn't to have any odds. Sum up the change in Mrs. Popo. Sums up, summarization is that change in the Mrs. Popo that the Toby isn't to have any odds. Isn't to have means the love for her husband ends, and suddenly her love for the horses of her husband, the Toby and others, ends abruptly. She forgets everything. The Boor derives from the character's lack of self-knowledge. They don't know about themselves. In the start, we see Mrs. Popo don't know how to behave after the death of her husband. She continuously mourning and mourning. And we see Mr. Smiro don't know how to behave with ladies and how to behave with the another person when you goes to their home. He don't know. The lack of self-knowledge. They both don't know what they want. Smiro don't know that what does he want, and Popo also don't know what does he want. She wants to mourn for her husband, last husband, but at last she accepts the love of Smiro. Smiro wants only money, and she accepts Mrs. Popo as her woman, as her wife. This shows the hypocrisy of the rich family or the aristocratic family. The play shows the false sentiments of rich society. This is a play which represented the pre-revolutionary Russia. Pre-revolutionary Russia, before the revolution, which shows the false sentiment of rich society. Rich people pretend to be kind, pretend to be sad, but they actually don't never be happy, never be sad. Because they are artificial, they are hypocritic people. They only show, they never feel it by the heart. And they can change at any time. This play is written by Anton Chekhov, who want to give his account and who want to give his thought about the rich society. This is a comedy. Comic play have a happy ending, and we saw that both the hero and heroine embrace each other. It's a happy ending, or its open ending can be said because Luca saw them embrace. They will be married or not, we cannot say it, but the end is called happy ending. Now I want to summarize all the story in some words. At the start we saw that Mrs. Popo is going to mourn and continuously mourning about her husband's death and refuse to stop the mourning. Luca, who was her servant, wants to console her and want to produce her that please stop the mourning because her husband was not a good person, he was a rude person and he beat her and he was a liquor, he was a drunken person. But she refuses all the questions of Mr. Luca. Then suddenly she said that give the oat to the Toby because she loved Toby, the horse, because her husband also loved the Toby. And oat is food for the horses. Then Luca announced that a person, Mr. Smiro, wants to see her, and she refuses that she was not at home. She don't want to meet anybody because she is in the mourning position of her husband. But the person, Mr. Smiro, abruptly entered into the house and demand her to his money, who was debated her husband earlier. But she excuses him and said that tomorrow she can give the money because her manager is gone to the city. He refuses to move a bit, and then the situation goes in a duel, goes in a battlefield, and they try to defeat one another. Suddenly, Mrs. Popo took a pistol and want to kill Mr. Spiro, but she does not know how to use the pistol. Then Mr. Spiro tried to persuade her, tried to teach her that how to use, try to show her how to use the pistol, and they come nearer, and Mr. Smiro fall in love with her, and he proposes her, and she abruptly accept, and she forget about her husband, she forget about anything, and accept the love of Mr. Smiro, and the servant Luca founds them embrace with each other, and he found them in their arms. This story shows the sentiments, the false sentiments of the rich society and the hypocrisy of rich society. Thanks.